When you play the Game of Thrones, you
Subscribe and like.
or you die. There is no middle ground.
Alright, hello YouTube, welcome back to the Grease Comedy YouTube channel. Today's video, we're going to continue our reread of Song of Ice and Fire, or Game of Thrones specifically. We're going to be hitting Bran II. Now, Bran II is a very interesting chapter. From you look at it from the idea of the start of this chapter is very slow. There actually isn't a lot that goes on in this chapter outside of the back 3 pages. Which is really what I think is very interesting to talk about this chapter. So when we get done with this chapter, or if you guys want to leave your thoughts down in the comments below, what do you guys rate this chapter? Because when I was doing my rating, giving this, chapter a summary, a quick summary, and then a overall rating, I found it very difficult. Because this is one of the most impactful chapters within all of A Song of Ice and Fire, alongside of like Catelyn 2 kickstarting the plot. This one also really kickstarts the plot as well. But it's chapter, like, as we get into it and as I'm talking about it more, you guys will kind of understand why it's a hard one to judge. Because, again, this is a chapter where we're only with Bran. Bran is completely alone for the most part in this chapter until the very end. And like I've talked about a lot with Bran as a POV, Bran in these early books, a lot of the times it's him kind of just being a plot device almost. Where I talk about this a little bit with Areo Hoda, where Areo Hoda is really just a POV into the Duran camp, whereas Bran is kind of the same thing for the Stark camp. Bran has a bit more personality and a bit more going on, but that's kind of how I look at Bran, and that this chapter represents that perfectly. Whereas in Bran 1, we saw how Bran wasn't really the main character in his own POV. It was really about establishing Robb and Jon and their differences, and Ned about who he was, how Stark's all about. It was less about Bran. So when we get into Bran 1, we're going to start on page 76, and as you guys can see in the background, page 76 is kind of about Robert, Ned, and most of the party is going on this hunt, right? Robert wants to get a boar, a little bit of a wink to his death later on, for the feast later on. So the idea here is that Bran is kind of be left alone in the castle, like it's going to be kind of emptied out of all of the men and stuff. And we also note here that Bran is going to have to say his goodbyes, right? This is one of the last chapters. We're going to see a lot of our characters, like Ned, in Winterfell. So he's kind of having to do that. But before we get into that, so page 76, we note that actually everyone is going, even Tyrion, besides Jaime. Jaime is not going. It leaves this interesting idea in your head as a reader where you're like, wait a second, why is all of these men characters going on these hunt? All of our important characters like Robb is going, like Theon's going, Ned's going, Robert's going. Why isn't Jaime going? So it kind of already plants that seed. And also, like I talked about, they're set to leave tomorrow. So this whole Stark-Baratheon alliance, everyone going south to King's Landing, they're going to be leaving tomorrow. We have a bit of a time jump when you think about Catelyn 2 to Bran 2. You also had Arya's chapter in the middle of that, but we don't really know the time frame in there on how much time has passed. But we notice here that a lot of time has passed between this chapter and that. So that's something that is also interesting to note. Now, what we see here from Bran is, remember, Bran is very young, right? And Bran is very young and naive, right? Bran says that Jon seems to be angry at everyone these days, and he was nowhere to be found. Now, you could take this a lot of ways, and I think one of those ways is every chapter we note, right, has someone forgetting how Jon is this bastard. He's not an equal to, for instance, the Stark family. We see that in Arya's chapter. Arya is very close to Jon, but even she forgets that Jon is not allowed to practice sword fighting with princes, or like that idea. Catelyn 2 is all about kind of talking down and how she hates Jon. Sansa being how she hates Jon. Jon in this moment he's a young teenager who's definitely in his moody phase, but also he's making a really big decision here going to the Night's Watch, one that he really wasn't involved in. He says something drunkenly at a feast, and now he's uprooting his entire life, taking this vow that's life-changing. He's saying goodbye to the only home he's known. It's weird to think about it, but that Bran doesn't kind of understand, at least on the base value, why Jon will be a bit angry. And Bran, again, we even build on this even further. Bran doesn't understand this at all. He's basically going, I don't know why Jon's the one that's angry, right? That he should be happy he's going to the wall with Benjen, that's, good for him. Which to me just doesn't make any sense. It's just one of those things where Bran's a very young kid and he just doesn't understand the world. It's one of those things where we talk about with Jon all the time on this channel, is that Jon early on at this point is someone that is much more developed. He's much more mature. He sees the world much more openly than I think a lot of our characters do. And Bran even goes even further, is that if anyone should be angry, it's Robb, because Robb is the one being left behind. Because remember, Bran, Arya, and Sansa are all scheduled to go south. Also, Ned's going to go. So when you think about it, the only people left in Winterfell of the Stark family are going to be Robb, Rickon, and Catelyn. So, again, I don't think Bran understands what's going on. And there's this common theme that all of these characters are so excited to leave home and go explore the world, which is a common theme throughout a lot of stories. And eventually they're going to end up missing home. And the ironic part is Bran is going to be the one that's actually going to be left at Winterfell. Robb's going to go to war with Catelyn. Well, Catelyn doesn't go to war, but she kind of does. Catelyn goes to do her own little thing with, exploring the Lannisters and the plot of killing Bran and all this stuff. So everybody kind of leaves Bran. It's actually quite the opposite when you think about it. So it's an interesting little note that we have here. And Bran is really, he's just excited to go off south. He's kind of like Sansa in this regard. And I noted a little bit later on when we get in this chapter that Bran and Sansa are a lot more similar than we give them credit for. Bran, I still think, takes a bit more after the Starks than Sansa does. But in this moment, we see how Bran's like excited to go live in the castle with the dragon lords, which again, as a young kid, I think anybody would be really excited to go do that. And that kind of leads us into page 77, but there's also some other things that we're going to talk about with how Bran wants to be a knight and being in the Kingsguard, and he's excited to see Barristan. There's a lot of things that are kind of like that fairy tale life that Bran's thinking about, that Sansa also does the same thing. So I wanted to point out some of the similarities between Bran and Sansa, and that will get us into page 77. So page 77 continues by saying that Old Nan says the dungeons have terrible things done in them. This is kind of a wink to Maegor and also the dragon skulls, and how Bran has nothing to fear because Ned would be there with his knights. So again, kind of a similar sentiment to what we think about when Arya says it. It's like, you will protect Ned, like you won't let anything happen to him, as we see later on. And Arya's a little bit more skeptical, whereas Bran and Sansa think, oh, we have these honorable knights and all these people, we're going to be completely safe, no one would ever harm our dad. And we see how that doesn't really play out, and that doesn't work out, but it's showing the naivety of these young children and the Stark family as a whole when you think about it. And like I said, in the last page, Bran wants to be a Kingsguard, and he wants to be a knight. And we even get a specific name drop to some very important Kingsguard. For the people that are watching House of the Dragon or interested in the Dance of the Dragons time period, the Erics are named here, and that were on the Kingsguard for also the Greens and the Black side. We see Aemon the Dragon Knight, who is a reoccurring character. Well, not a reoccurring character, but a reoccurring person that is named in history. We note that, like Jon, Bran thinks the Kingsguard that came north, only Jaime really looked like a Kingsguard. And we have this constant theme that Jaime kind of fits the bill of being this really awesome knight of the Kingsguard and being a kingly figure. It again kind of plays on that idea that I think George, in an alternate universe and his original manuscripts, had Jaime as being a far different character, where he was the character that became king and was like our ultimate bad character. I think that was kind of a wink to that. And we kind of learn another interesting detail here, is that we learn a bit more about how Ned and also Robb view Jaime, and kind of this whole idea of, was it right for Jaime to kill the Mad King? And we know here that Robb basically tells Bran that Jaime shouldn't even have a cloak. He shouldn't be in the Kingsguard because he killed the king, breaking his vow. And it's what makes it very interesting, because we're learning about the Stark side viewing Jaime's actions, whereas later on down the road in A Storm of Swords, we're going to learn more of Jaime's perspective on that. and bringing up the ideas of vows and loyalty and all of those things that make this universe so great. So just an early nod to how Rob kind of views Jamie as a person. Also, we learn, again, like I had said earlier on, that Bran is excited to meet Barristan. And again, I noted in my notes, who wouldn't be? Like Barristan the Bold, this legendary knight. He's kind of like the last great knight in the Kingsguard. That, again, who wouldn't be? If you were wanting to be a knight in this world, who wouldn't be excited to beat probably, if not the greatest, one of the greatest knights of all time? And lastly, Bran has been so excited to leave that now that the time is actually here, he's dreading leaving his home, and he doesn't want to have to say his goodbyes. And, Ned has been saying, you got to make your goodbyes because we're going to leave tomorrow. And he's been trying. And we learned that he's been failing, that this doesn't really go well. And I think this is just kind of another, realistic thing where you can be so excited to do something, and then when you finally do, you kind of look back, or you're about to either move out of your house, an apartment you're in, and you kind of think, you're like, wow, I'm gonna miss this, or something to that degree. And that's kind of how Bran's feeling, where the time has just flown by, where Bran maybe thought he had more time to be home, and he was just looking forward to this adventure. And now that he has to say goodbye, it's a bit rough on him. And we also, see that Bran has our first introduction really to Hodor, because Bran tries to go down to the stables to kind of say his goodbye to one of his horses, because he's going to get a new one. And we learn here, as we'll get into page 78, this doesn't really go well. So picking up where we left off, in page 77, we learned basically that Bran just wasn't doing a good job of this. Bran was struggling to do this, so instead, he decides to go to the Godswood, and he tries to teach Summer to fetch a stick. Now, again, Summer is not named Summer yet, and we note that Bran has noted that all of his brothers and sisters, or I guess half-brothers if you want to go with Jon, have named their direwolves, but Bran hasn't. And we go through the names. They're all very fitting. You have Lady for Sansa. We talked about that in Arya's chapter, as well as Nymeria and also Ghost. All very fitting names. And now we learn that Rickon's is named Shaggy Dog. Kind of a fitting name as well. Kind of more of a wild name, which kind of fits Rickon. And then Greywind. I think just a really badass name. And it is really an amazing wolf name when you think about the wars to come. So I think all the names fit really well. I think George did a pretty good job there. And Bran kind of just gets bored. He's a kid and he wants to go explore, and he starts to climb a tree. What I think is interesting we note here is that the heart tree has always been strange to Bran, and it's even kind of frightened him. And what I think is interesting is, is there a warning here to Bran to not climb? Because Summer starts to howl at him, almost warning him not to climb. And we see this as a reoccurring theme, that it seems like there's some presence here telling him not to do this. But why would we see that? Because we know that Bloodraven wants him more or less to go north of the wall. Well, he'd have to, if his legs weren't broken, why would he ever do that? Right? Because the main whole thing was that Bran thought that he would either get his legs back, he'd be able to walk again. And we know that's not exactly true. It's one of the kind of the manipulations and kind of the sus things we see with Bran going north of the wall, and what Bloodraven kind of tells him they're going to be able to do, like he's going to be able to fly. So it's interesting to see that George kind of writes in all of these signs telling Bran to not climb, but yet he keeps going. And what we're going to learn about these next couple of pages is that Bran really likes to climb. So get prepared for that. The next few pages is just like Bran recounting stories of how he's such a good climber, but his mom doesn't want him to, and he just rebels. It's kind of that back and forth, and it's one of the things that does, I think, slow this chapter down quite a bit. But we'll get into that as we get into the next page. So on to page 79. This page really, when I say really, I have 2 bullet points for this page. It really focuses on how good of a climber Bran is, and how old Winterfell feels, and we really get that sense that it is a very ancient castle, and it's very ancient in the way that it is built. And we also note that Catelyn tells Bran he needs to stop climbing, he will fall and kill himself. Another bit of foreshadowing. And that's it for page 79. That's all I had written down. Again, this part getting into the Jamie Cersei stuff at the end, there's not a lot here. Whereas a lot of other chapters, whether that's Ned or Jon or Catelyn, we get a lot of their internal conflict and a lot of their personality, or we get lore stuff going on. Bran doesn't have a lot of that. Bran is a character that we don't know much about him, or he doesn't have much of a personality. He's a naive, just normal kid who wants to be a knight and he likes to climb. That's majority of what we see from Bran. But that's going to lead us into page 80, and we're going to start to kind of get into the more juicy stuff once we get to like page 82. But continuing on with page 80. Page 80, we kind of continue with this. There's this story that Bran was, climbing, he disobeyed his mother, and Ned kind of goes, okay, we're going to lock you in the Godswood all night for punishment of climbing. And the next morning, they find that he's climbed into a tree. We even see that his mother tried to get even other people to stop him from climbing, like Maester Lewin, old Nan, and nothing has worked. He just likes climbing. So again, that's all I had down for page 80, because these pages really, really are focusing on him climbing. So again, I want to kind of skip into page 81 as well. I'm probably not even going to change the page number, because I had one bullet point down for page 81. This page is basically about how Bran gets to the first keep. Also is foreshadowing of how he liked the birds and being high up. When finally reaches the gargoyles of the tower, he hears voices. So this is when the chapter kind of picks up and we get kind of more of our juicy stuff going on. So I wanted to kind of get through this section of the chapter quickly. There's not a lot really here that's worth discussing. So that's kind of going to get us into page 82. So page 82, there's voices, and this is very odd right away, because Bran notes that there's never anyone here, and he is so shocked that he almost loses his grip. So again, the whole chapter's been building up of how good Bran is. He never falls. He's very good at climbing, and this alone makes him almost fall. And again, we don't really know who's talking yet at this moment, but Cersei starts saying how she dislikes Ned becoming the Hand, and that Jaime should be the Hand, to which Jaime says he doesn't want that work. And again, this shows kind of the two characters already, but Cersei is someone that is taking this a bit more seriously, where Ned becoming the Hand is very dangerous for Cersei and Jaime in their situation. And Jaime is just this character right now that's very arrogant, where he just doesn't see anything as a problem. Jaime at this point of his story believes that he can pretty much defeat anyone with a sword, right? And he can win with violence. It's a character trait we see a lot with characters like Daemon Targaryen, Maegor, that they can do those things. Even Aemond. And to me, it's interesting that when Jaime loses, it's kind of how his personality changes. When he loses his hand, that kind of switches up a bit. But to me, that is where Jaime is at this current moment. And Cersei is kind of saying that Ned is different. Robert's going to listen to him. Like, Ned is not like Stannis or Renly, where Robert might brush them off. And this is one of the reasons I think that we see that Stannis leaves to go to Dragonstone. He sees how dangerous he is as a position. And Renly, I think, also knows. It's never confirmed if Renly kind of knew about the children or that Cersei and Jaime were together. I personally think so. But I don't think Renly, in the same idea as Stannis, doesn't believe he has the sway to make Robert believe him. And Ned is just something different. Robert views Ned more like a brother and came all this way to ask him to be Hand. If Ned was to make these allegations and to figure out what was going on, it would be much more dire for House Lannister and Cersei and Jaime and their children as a whole. Another thing that this kind of brings up this early in the story is this relationship between Robert, Stannis, and Renly already. And it's something the show didn't do that well. It's one of my major critiques of season 1, was we don't really see that. We don't really see the relationship of Renly, Stannis, and Robert. And we don't even see Stannis like in this entire book, but we already have this preconceived image of him through dialogue and thoughts of other characters before we even meet Stannis in book 2. The show didn't really do that. In the show, it kind of felt like Stannis was just this character that was just name dropped as being Robert's brother, but we don't get much after that. So I like that we kind of see their dynamic early on from a character outside like Robert or Ned, where even Cersei notes that like they're not that close. And it also kind of brings up this idea that, well, if Robert has two brothers, why aren't either one of them Hand of the King? It just shows how much they aren't really like normal brothers. They don't have that love for each other, because in any normal situation, Robert would have just named Stannis' hand and been done with it. But we kind of see how that developed. And Cersei herself, and this kind of shows a lot about Ned as a character, thought that Ned would refuse, which is true. Ned wanted to refuse. If it wasn't for this secret message, Ned probably would have refused, because Catelyn would have not have had this ammunition that, oh, Robert's in trouble, Jon Arryn possibly was murdered. That probably wouldn't have happened. Ned probably would have won the argument and said, okay, we're not going south. And even Cersei notes this, that something had to have happened to have pushed Ned to doing that. And this is how confident Cersei was that he wasn't going to come south, is that Cersei had not even asked Robert about Jaime being the hand, because she just thought, okay, I could just do it when we go back to King's Landing, let this whole thing play out with Ned and Robert, and then we'll go south. Ned won't accept, and then I can bring up the idea. That's how confident Cersei was that this wasn't going to happen. And again, what's interesting is that when Jaime kind of refutes this, right, Jaime's kind of like, well, there's other hand options that Robert would have chosen above me. And one of the names that's listed this early on in the story is Littlefinger. This shows, one, how powerful Littlefinger's perceived power is. If someone like Jaime thinks that someone like Littlefinger could become Hand of the King, kind of a big move. Now, again, I don't think this was going to happen. I don't think there was any way that was going to happen. I think it's much more likely that Stannis or Renly would have become Hand. But it is interesting that Jaime kind of puts this power on Littlefinger this early, and it paints a picture of who we should expect Littlefinger to be as a person, where when we see Littlefinger later on, whether that be with Catelyn or Ned in this book, they treat him like a servant. They treat him like someone that doesn't have any power, whereas Jaime notes that he has very real power. And the whole time, Bran's kind of just hanging out, trying to figure out who's talking, and then he kind of realizes, oh wait, shit, they're talking about my dad. I really need to figure out what's going on here, and he tries to basically move closer. But like, this chapter really signifies what chapter 1 for Bran was, where Bran is just kind of listening to other more interesting characters talk, and that to me is really shows what Bran's chapters are really like on these early chapters for the most part. And at this point, Jaime's getting bored. Like, Jaime is getting to be a horny boy at this point, and he's trying to, you know, seduce his sister. I know, weird, but that's kind of where this like chapter's going. And what is interesting, and I'd already mentioned it, but at the end of this page, Cersei, again, all of her faults, she isn't stupid. And Cersei, I think in the early books, she isn't stupid. Like, she does like rationally think about things. And I think she gets the label of being stupid because of Feast, where she has a lot of emotional damage and things that make her very either spiteful or kind of traumatized to a degree. In this moment, she's very smart. She even like basically picks up exactly what's going on. Now, it isn't that Lysa is technically Lysa is moving the plot, but it's really Littlefinger that's making this whole thing happen. But Cersei even notes that. Like, she is basically saying, okay, something motivated Ned to come south. And that's very scary to her. And she should be. That's a very reasonable assessment of what's going on, especially with how confident she was that he wasn't going to accept the hand. So that will lead us into page 83. Cersei starts page 83 by saying that Lysa may have known about them, and that is really bad. Because here's the thing. Jon Arryn, we know, was looking into this, right? And if Jon Arryn had told Lysa about this, if she has some knowledge that she could tell Ned, really not good, right? Because here's the other big play here that you have to be thinking about if you're from Cersei's point of view here. Why does Lysa, in the middle of the night, run away to the Eyrie? And in Cersei's mind, I think she comes to the conclusion that, okay, now that she has her son free, he's not going to be taken to Tywin Lannister, she's in a position of leverage where she has nothing to lose now, right? Her son's safe. She could then sell information to Robert or Ned. And Jamie kind of comes to the conclusion that I think a lot of characters do at this point, which isn't entirely wrong, is that Lysa has just gone mad. And on the face value of it, maybe it's not a bad assessment, but at the same time, there is something else going on that you can obviously tell. It's not just Lysa being mad. At the very base minimum, you should come to the conclusion that Lysa was trying to protect her son. And that's very obvious and apparent, and something Jamie doesn't really pick up on. And again, Bran this whole time is just trying to get over to this window that he can look through, as you see in the picture where like Jamie has his hand on Bran. He's trying to like get to this window. It's just in a very awkward position, right? Because Bran is kind of above right where this window is, and he's trying to lower himself down. But the problem here is that there's no real way of climbing down where it seems like he's going to be quiet and not make a sound. And it's very risky to this idea. Now, an interesting idea is brought to the table by Cersei. Ned is very loyal to Robert, but what of Joffrey? Again, this is a great observation by Cersei in this moment where, yes, Cersei cares about, or Ned cares a lot about Robert, but he has no real affiliation with Joffrey. Joffrey already in Ned's mind is not a great dude. And what will happen then? Like, once Robert dies, what will Ned think of Joffrey? An interesting idea here. And the other interesting part of this is Cersei kind of already realizes in her head, what if Robert puts me aside for another girl that's like Lyanna, right? We know that Robert's still in love with Lyanna. What if somebody comes along that looks very similar to Lyanna, like a Marjorie, possibly, which is the kind of Renly plot of having Marjorie marry Robert and deposing Cersei. Cersei, in this moment, when you really think about everything she's talked about in this chapter, she's kind of hit the nail on. Like, there's a lot of plots like that haven't even been revealed to her yet that she's kind of already thought of in her head and are already playing that game in her head. This chapter really goes to establish that Cersei, when she is allowed to, like when she's not going through a bunch of emotional turmoil and stuff, she's very good at kind of understanding what other people's motives are and what possible things could be working on in the background. And Bran at this point wants to turn back, but he needs proof of who's talking, because a lot of what he's hearing right now is very damning. And if he could tell, like, Robb, for instance, or Jon, and get this to Ned, could be very interesting. So page 84 is pretty much going to be about continuing this conversation. It's actually not going to be much of a conversation as some action starts. Wink, wink, Jamie doing some action. And Bran trying to get a better look. So that will get us into page 84. So again, at page 84, we start seeing Cersei and Jamie having sex. We hear Bran, like, hearing some weird noises and, like, you know, a kid trying to interpret sex. Kind of weird. But, you know, it's what happens. It's what happens. And Bran kind of reaches for a gargoyle to the right of the window and looks in and sees them, quote unquote, wrestling. And while they're having sex, Bran realizes that this woman is the queen. And at this moment, he must have made a sound because Cersei sees him and screams. So Bran kind of messes up here. Like we had just hinted at before, getting to this window was very difficult to do silently. And Bran kind of fails the skill check, we'll say. And this has now brought all the attention to Bran. And Bran, he's like trying to quickly get out of here. He tries to pull himself up and get away, but he slips and starts falling. Now, he gets his left hand on the ledge right before he falls, but he's now in a very sticky situation because he's heard a lot of delicate information. He's seen some things he doesn't need to have seen, and that will lead us into page 85 and our last page of the chapter. Now, I think is very interesting about page 85 is that Bran, now that he's been kind of lifted up, right, and pulled into the window, Bran realizes the man is Jamie. So now Bran has now put together that Jamie and Cersei are together. Cersei's basically like instantly like, Jamie, he saw us. And what I think is really weird about this chapter is that Jaime pulls up Bran to then push him and saying his famous line, like, the things I do for love, as he pushes Bran out the window. It's interesting because Jaime could have just let Bran fall and slip to his death. I think it's interesting that Jaime, or I guess George writes it this way, where it's like hanging off tower, about to die, and slip and fall and die, gets pulled up to just then get pushed right out. It's a very interesting way that this chapter ends. I kind of like the way the show did this change, where it was kind of like Bran kind of looks in through the window, sees them, and then Jaime just comes over to the window and then pushes him. It makes a bit more sense. I don't know what you guys think about the ending of this chapter. Again, the ending, like, 4 pages is what makes this chapter. It's some of the best pages we've gotten so far in this book. And it's unfortunate that it's a Bran chapter, because the beginning of this chapter is just really slow paced, not as interesting. And I would say generally, like, the first 5 pages of this chapter are probably some of the worst of the first book. But it just has such a fantastic ending that, to me, if you're going to rank the chapters, this one still at least has to be middle of the pack because of its ending. But I don't know. Let me know what you guys think about this chapter. That's kind of the end. So kind of a shorter one again, just like last week's. But again, wasn't a ton in this chapter outside of the ending. Let me know what you guys thought, and I will see you guys all in next week's video. I'm not actually sure what chapter it is. I think it's probably Tyrion 1, if I'm not mistaken. And I hope you guys all enjoyed the video. I'll see you guys all in the next one. Bye, guys.